Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. I thought I'd do a little video that hopefully some child might find when researching for a school project or for just curiosity some stage. And rather than go through a general farm update or do anything specific, I thought I'd have a little discussion about the history of the macadamia and how it came to be cultivated, because it's actually not a bad little story. And while if you do your research on the internet, and it's not hard to do these days, you can find all the information I'm about to give you, I thought I'd set it to video on a YouTube movie taken in the traditional home of the macadamia, which is where the species originated. That is the northern rivers of New South Wales, the very northeastern corner of the state of New South Wales for those watching overseas, and immediately to its north, the southeastern part of Queensland, which is another significant place where a lot of our modern macadamias came from. I'm walking among a large variety of macadamia trees now, but and you can see some macadamia nuts growing on those trees. There's some nuts developing into quite a nice crop that'll fall this autumn. But how and where did it all begin? Australia was settled by European colonists from England in 1788, and it wasn't until about 1820 that they started noticing the macadamia nut's existence. And it wasn't till about 1857 that a botanist recorded it as an actual genus, that is a type of plant, officially. And the name macadamia you'd think would be named after the person who discovered it, and it actually is named after a person. It's named after a man called John Macadam. But he's not the one who discovered it. It was actually catalogued and put together by a German-Australian botanist called Ferdinand von Muller. And he named it after his friend, John Macadam. John Macadam probably never got to taste a macadamia nut in his life. He actually died at the tender age of 38 on a boat to New Zealand, where he was going to give evidence in a case of a man who had allegedly poisoned his wife. But he suffered some broken ribs on the journey and didn't make it. So that is the strange story of how the macadamia got its name. Nothing much was done with the macadamia, apart from the fact that the early Queensland government had records of the Aboriginal people who'd been eating this nut for centuries, if not thousands of years. The Aboriginal people got upset when the settlers cut macadamia trees down. And it was about in the 1860s that they realised that macadamias were a food. Obviously a very hard shell nut to crack, but they realised that the Aboriginal people valued them very much as a source of food. And the Queensland government then, to their credit, stopped the cutting down of macadamia trees so that they could provide that food for the indigenous population. Nothing much was done in terms of actually farming macadamias until 1888, when Australia was exactly 100 years old in terms of European settlement. And that was a little farm in Rouse Mill near Lismore, where a very enterprising man called Charles Staff put together the first macadamia farm ever. And it was, there's still remnants of it today, apparently. I don't know where. I'd love to visit it if I would. But there was a botanist called Joseph Maiden who wrote in his works, "It is well worth extensive cultivation, for the nuts are always eagerly bought." Funnily enough, the Australians weren't the first to follow that advice. There was a man called Purvis in Hawaii who took home some seeds of the macadamia to Hawaii, and he actually didn't plan to grow the macadamia at that stage. he planned to use them as a windbreak tree, because they were thought, oh look, it's a nice dense bushy tree, you can see from here it would stop a bit of wind, and he thought it might be a good windbreak for coffee trees in the area. It turned out eventually that the nuts fell. They thought, well, what do we do with these? And they realised they were delicious, and then started farming them. Now that was around about the 1920s, and many of the varieties that they developed there from just crossbreeding, cross-pollination, many of the varieties you see today, including probably this one here, if it's a 246, came from those very farms in Hawaii, and actually came back to Australia, where we had the benefit of their head start in cultivation. Now, it wasn't, Hawaii was first in the world until 1997, when Australian production caught up and eventually overtook Hawaii. We only held the crown until about 2012, when South Africa came in on top of us. And with the exception of last year, where Australia pulled ahead again, South Africa has been fairly much the world's largest producer of macadamias, with a reasonably compatible climate to ours. And they get some great results down there, and we often find in our trade shows that we have South African producers lecturing Australian farmers on what to do and what best practices they're developing in their own farms. Some of them we adopt, and others I think we don't. But they're certainly getting the results. There's no doubting that. But it all comes from this area. Now, macadamias were defined as a genus, so let's come back to that thought. A genus is a kind of plant. Within that, there are species. Species are different, effectively subgroups or a sub-variety of the genus, or members of the genus. So it's like having brothers and sisters in a family, if you like. The genus is the family, and the brothers and sisters are effectively species. But beneath that, there are what's called varietals, or we call them varieties, and sometimes they're called cultivars. And they're different cultivars, all grown all over here. In fact, in the camera sweep that I'm doing now, there's a good 4 or 5 different varieties of macadamia on display. And they all come from different species. Now, macadamias, and macadamias have 4 different species that are documented to date. One is called Tetrafilla, and this particular tree here, which is an A4, I think, may be an example of a Tetrafilla or a Tetrafilla hybrid. We don't grow any pure Tetrafillas. There is one variety in South Africa that is pure Tetrafilla. Tetrafilla means 4 leaves. And in an absolute Tetrafilla situation, each whorl of leaves, that's a whorl, W-H-O-R-L, each group of leaves, like whorl, is 4 leaves. Now, this particular one, which is an A4, it's a hybrid with a Tetrafilla, has only 3. And most of our varieties that are grown here have 3 leaves per whorl. That's where my fingers are. So that's why it's called Tetrafilla. There's Iintegrifolia, and Iintegrifolia means entire leaf. And that basically is a shorthand way of saying wide leaf macadamia. And, you know, the Iintegrifolia leaf typically can look something like this, although there's a few different variations of it. Tetrafilla or Tetrafilla hybrids, on the other hand, tend to have more jagged leaves, and this particular one, this is an A4, I believe, does have some of those signs of a jagged leaf arrangement. There's a rootstock here which is definitely Iintegrifolia. This is definitely Tetrafilla, and it's growing up from the base with fairly jagged sort of leaves as well. A third variety called macadamia ternifolia has 3 leaves as well. It's a more reddish looking plant, a smaller tree, and its nuts are not palatable. They're not used in production. We only use basically Iintegrifolia and Tetrafilla and hybrids of those two, except in the case of one variety called 791, bred in Hawaii. It's about 45% Tetrafilla. It's the only example of Tetrafilla being used in production. Although you'd wonder whether perhaps more experiments will be done with it, but because it's a small tree, it doesn't produce, when you hybridize it, it doesn't produce great big trees like this. They tend to be a bit small and straggly. 791 was tried in Australia in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it had some okay results, but the tree just didn't have a great habit. The 4th variety, Macadamia Jansenia, wasn't discovered until 1991, and that was by an amateur Queensland botanist who, not surprisingly, had the surname Jansen, and he named it after himself. That was a stand of only about 60 to 100 trees. It's very, very endangered. The indigenous population didn't think very much of it because its nuts were in fact poisonous. They contained cyanide. And so no one's really proposing to use that in the production of new varieties for food, as you could probably imagine. They're also small and very bitter, as it probably wouldn't surprise you. So, yeah, we have, now really in the stock of macadamia trees that we grow, of the 4 species, there's only really 2 that's used, and they're different combinations of each. The advantages and disadvantages, well, I like to call Tetrafilla, if you know the story of the tortoise and the hare, I like to call Tetrafilla the hare and Iintegrifolia the tortoise, because the macadamias based on Iintegrifolia are slow to crop, but they're quite big trees in the end. If you prune them, they take a while to get over the insult of being pruned, but in general they're slow and steady trees, and they can go on producing for you for a very long time if you maintain them properly. Often they traditionally take up to 5, sometimes even 8 years to give you a crop, and that was partly why macadamia demand has always run ahead of supply, because when people try and catch up with the demand for macadamias, it does take a while once you plant the orchards to actually get anything out of them. So it can be a bit of a long road. But then once you do plant them, unfortunately, the tetrafillas, which are really quick, and people like hybridizing with them, because when you hybridize with tetrafilla, you can get some quick cropping varieties. When you hybridize with them, that's great. You'll get early crops, but what's tended to happen with Tetrafilla hybrids is that once they get to a certain age, I know that Garth in the Australian Macadamia channel said, look, about 14 years, they really need either a lot of maintenance or pulling up and starting again in order to stay productive. When you prune them, they'll come back fast. There's no doubt about that, and they are smaller trees than the Iintegrifolia. Funnily enough, I've just stumbled across a tree that's made a liar out of me. This is a 246, which is pure Iintegrifolia. This shouldn't be cropping for years yet, and yet, look, it's got some nuts. I don't know how it managed that. I don't think they'll probably go through to fruition, but well done, 246. You've outdone yourself. But the mixtures of them keep on getting given to us as growers, and they work sometimes in our part of the world, sometimes they work better in other countries. South Africa grows different versions of the macadamia to Australia, but then they grow some that are just exactly the same varieties that we grow. And it's still a growing industry throughout the world. We've got plantations in Kenya, even Malawi, other African countries. They're trying them in China. They're even trying some in South America, in Brazil, where the climate matches the requirements. And I've done separate videos on where you can grow macadamias in the world. And so, how dominant are macadamias in relative to other nuts? Well, it's tiny for now anyway. The crop are growing for macadamias, but they're, for example, way behind commercial plantations of pecans, almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts. These are the other genuine tree nuts that people buy. These are all much larger markets than the macadamia. In general, the nuts are a lot cheaper as well and more common, and that may happen in time with the macadamia, although there are natural limits on where you can grow these things, and people have learned to plant things like almonds in all sorts of places where they probably shouldn't be grown, and yet they can get a crop out of them. The macadamia tree can be a bit fussy, as you all learn as macadamia farmers, and my argument is it's best to grow them where they are naturally occurring, because not only are you likely to get the best result, but you will do it with the least amount of meddling with nature in terms of irrigation, feeding, that sort of thing. If you've got that ability to rely on, for example, natural rainfall to fall when it's meant to for the macadamia crop, and that is in late spring and summer, that's a whole lot better than growing them in dry areas that, you know, only occasionally get enough rain to do that, and, you know, the costs of irrigation are involved. But, you know, as with anything, there's trade-offs. It's an industry that, you know, does rely very much on premium farmland to get a premium nut, and I don't think that's going to change in the near future. What's happening with the future of the macadamia? Well, Hawaii still grows about a little under a tenth of the world's macadamia nuts, so they're not giving up. The focuses of excellence are Australia and South Africa, and a lot of our intellectual property then goes through to the other countries that are producing them, particularly some poorer countries have the resources they need to do the research. And it's a matter of working out what works for each country, and also the farming methods used. We're very machine intensive in Australia. Other countries can be quite labour intensive in that they can really manage each tree as an asset rather than deal with things like pruning or even feeding just on a one-size-fits-all basis. I'm going to have some fertiliser spread on this orchard soon, and this particular baby tree in front of you will get exactly the same food as the adults that surround it. It's not going to care, in fact it's going to like it, but it's not not something where I can individually feed every single tree to its needs. So for anyone this has helped with a school project or otherwise, thank you for watching. You don't have to like or subscribe. I don't care about any of that. It doesn't help me. But if you do want to see more about macadamia farming, there's plenty of videos I've made already, and I keep releasing them on a fairly regular basis. Now, as you can see, I've got some mowing to do to keep the grass under control in these trees, and we will we'll start making it look spick and span for the upcoming summer season. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you learned something. I did in the preparation for it, and I'll see you again soon.